There is a particular kind of silence that lives inside success. Not the peaceful kind, the kind that waits, just beneath the applause, just behind the promotion, just after the congratulations have faded from the room. It whispers something strange, something that doesn't quite make sense from the outside. You don't deserve this. And the person hearing it isn't someone who has failed. It's someone who has done everything right. Someone with credentials on the wall and doubt in their chest. Someone who has built something real and still cannot fully believe it belongs to them. This is not a story about failure. It is a story about the quiet terror of success, about what happens inside the minds of people who achieve and still feel, somewhere deep and unnamed, like they are about to be found out. The applause they cannot hear. Picture a room full of people clapping, and in the center of that room, someone is smiling, nodding, accepting the recognition with a practiced grace that took years to learn. They look comfortable. They look like they belong there. But inside, something is very still, very quiet, and very unconvinced. This is the part no one sees. The moment after the award is given, when the person returns to their seat and thinks, they don't really know me. The moment after the promotion, when the new title feels like borrowed clothing. The moment after the compliment, when the mind immediately searches for the error the other person must have missed. High-achieving adults are often the last people anyone would suspect of suffering. They carry their doubt invisibly. They have learned, through years of performance, how to look like they believe in themselves, even when they do not. And so they exist in a strange double life. Outwardly, accomplished, capable, recognized. Inwardly, waiting, always waiting for someone to notice the cracks, to see through the surface, to finally say the thing the inner voice has been saying for years: you were never supposed to be here. What makes this particularly painful is the isolation of it. Because who does the successful person tell? Who would believe them? The vulnerability of saying, I feel like a fraud, sits impossibly alongside the image others have built of you. So the feeling gets tucked away, managed, carried quietly. The applause continues. And somewhere inside, a person stands in a room they built with their own hands and cannot feel the floor beneath their feet. This is where the story begins. Not in failure, not in mediocrity, but in the strange, lonely place where achievement and self-doubt share the same breath. It begins in the silence between the celebration and the self. The gap between what the world sees and what the person knows, or believes they know, about who they really are. And that gap, for many high achievers, is not a passing moment of insecurity. It is a residence, a place they return to again and again, no matter how much they accomplish. No matter how many rooms full of people clap, the applause reaches them, but something older, something quieter, something far more stubborn, refuses to let it land. The roots beneath the armor. Nothing about a person's inner world arrives without a reason. The feelings that live in adulthood always have an address somewhere in the past. And imposter syndrome, this quiet, persistent sense of fraudulence, is no different. It did not begin in the boardroom. It did not begin at the graduation ceremony, or in smaller rooms, with smaller voices. And a child who was learning, without knowing they were learning, what they had to be in order to be enough. For many high achievers, childhood held a particular kind of love, one that was warm, but also conditional, not necessarily cruel, not always obvious, but tied in some quiet way to performance, to grades, to being good, to not causing trouble, to being the one who succeeded where others struggled. When a child receives approval most consistently in response to achievement, the mind begins to draw a map. It learns, my value lives in what I produce, not in who I am, but in what I do. And that map, once drawn in early life, tends to be carried silently into every room that follows. Some were the firstborn, handed responsibility before they could name it. Some were raised in homes where failure was not discussed, only avoided. Some received praise so specifically tied to intelligence or talent that they learned to fear any moment that might contradict it. Because if the praise was for being smart, then a single mistake threatened the entire identity. Others grew up surrounded by comparison, siblings who were labeled differently, schools that ranked, parents who, in their own way, were trying to motivate, not knowing they were also quietly installing fear. and some simply grew up in environments where uncertainty was unsafe, where not knowing the answer felt dangerous, where appearing capable was the only way to feel secure. The child learned to perform before they learned to rest, and so they grew into capable, driven, extraordinary adults who carried, beneath all of that capability, a foundational belief that had never quite been examined, a belief that said, the achievement is real, but the person behind it is not quite enough. This is the root, not weakness, not a flaw in character, but a very understandable adaptation, a way of surviving in an environment that tied love, safety, or belonging to performance. The armor was built for a reason. It protected something real. It helped them navigate, excel, and endure. But armor, no matter how necessary at the beginning, does not distinguish between the battlefield and the boardroom. It stays on, long after the original danger has passed. And beneath it, quiet, unchanged, still waiting, is the child who first learned that being enough required proof. What the mind does to protect itself. The mind is not trying to harm the person who achieves and doubts. It is trying to protect them. This is one of the quieter truths of psychology, that even the patterns which cause the most suffering are, at their core, attempts at safety. Imposter syndrome is not a malfunction. It is a very organized, very consistent system, running exactly as it was designed to run. Psychologists Pauline Clance and Suzanne Imes first named this pattern in 1978. They noticed it most acutely in high-achieving women, though decades of research since has confirmed it reaches across gender, culture, and profession. Estimates suggest that up to 70% of people will experience imposter feelings at some point in their lives, and among high performers, the numbers climb higher still. But why? Why does the mind resist accepting its own competence? The answer lives partly in something called attribution theory, the way the mind explains its own successes and failures. For someone living with imposter syndrome, the internal accounting is quietly asymmetrical. When something goes wrong, it is evidence, proof, the confirmation the inner voice has been waiting for. But when something goes right, the mind finds another explanation. Luck, timing, the generosity of others, anything that keeps the success outside the self, unreliable, not fully owned. There is also the phenomenon known as the Dunning-Kruger effect, and its lesser discussed counterpart. While that effect describes how limited knowledge can produce overconfidence, the reverse is equally true. Deep competence often produces deep awareness of how much remains unknown. The more a person truly understands their field, the more clearly they see its edges. And standing at those edges, the mind can mistake its own sophistication for inadequacy. The brain's threat detection system plays a role as well. The amygdala, that ancient, vigilant part of the mind trained to scan for danger, does not distinguish easily between physical threat and social exposure. For someone whose nervous system learned early that being seen as incompetent was unsafe, the brain treats public visibility as a form of risk. The higher the stakes, the louder the alarm. And so the mind does what it always does when it senses danger. It prepares. It over-prepares. It works harder, checks more carefully, revises more thoroughly, not from passion alone, but from fear. And when the result is good, which, because of all that effort, it often is, the mind attributes the success to the preparation, not to the person, to the system, not the self. The cycle feeds itself. Achievement produces visibility. Visibility produces fear. Fear produces effort. Effort produces more achievement. And somehow, through all of it, the person remains unproven to themselves. This is not irrational. It is a system with a terrible logic, a loop with no natural exit. Understanding it does not immediately dissolve it, but understanding it changes something. Because what was once felt as personal failing can begin to be seen for what it actually is, a pattern, a learned response, something that arrived from somewhere, and therefore, perhaps, can also go somewhere else. The weight of keeping the mask on. There is a particular kind of exhaustion that no one asks about. Not the tiredness that comes from working long hours or carrying heavy responsibilities. Though those are real, this is something quieter, something beneath the visible effort. The exhaustion of maintenance, of keeping a version of yourself intact that you are not entirely sure you believe in. For the high achiever who secretly doubts, Every public moment carries a small hidden weight, not just the task itself, but the management of how the task appears. Every presentation holds two layers: what is being communicated and whether it will reveal something that shouldn't be revealed. Every question asked by a colleague carries the subtext: do they suspect? Every mistake, however minor, is catalogued, not released. The mask is not worn with cynicism. That is important to understand. It is not deception in the ordinary sense. It is survival. It is the result of a mind that has concluded, somewhere along the way, that the full self is too uncertain, too unfinished, too risk-laden to show without filtering. And so a parallel self is curated, the version that speaks in meetings with authority, the version that accepts compliments with graceful deflection, the version that arrives early, prepares thoroughly, and never lets the uncertainty show. Because the uncertainty, it has been decided without quite being stated, would cost something too precious to lose. What gets lost in the carrying of this is intimacy, real intimacy, with colleagues, with mentors, with partners, with oneself, requires a kind of transparency that imposter syndrome makes feel dangerous. To be truly known is to risk being seen as less than the image. And so relationships, even close ones, can develop a slight but persistent distance, a layer of performance, a warmth that is genuine but also carefully managed. The person behind the mask often longs to be known, deeply known, to sit across from another human being and say, "I don't always know what I'm doing. I'm afraid of being wrong. Some days I wonder if I've fooled everyone." And to have that met not with shock or disappointment, but with recognition, with someone saying, "Me too," but the fear of what would happen if they said it out loud keeps the words from forming, and so the mask stays on, year after year, success after success. The outer world growing more impressed while the inner world grows more tired, more isolated, more uncertain whether the person beneath the performance is someone worth knowing at all. This is the cost that rarely appears in conversations about high achievement. Not burnout from effort alone, but burnout from self-concealment, from the energy spent not on doing the work, but on making sure the work never reveals too much of the person doing it. The weight of the mask is real, and it accumulates in silence. When the fraudulent self begins to dissolve, the shift, when it comes, rarely arrives as a revelation. It does not arrive in a single moment of clarity. There is no dramatic scene where the mask falls and light floods in. The dissolving of imposter syndrome is quieter than that, slower, more like the way winter loosens into spring. Not a single day, but a gradual, almost imperceptible warming. It often begins with a small act of honesty. A person says, in a meeting or in a conversation, or perhaps only in a journal kept in private, "I'm not entirely sure about this." And the world does not end. The room does not go cold. Nobody stands up and says, "We knew it. We always knew." Instead, something unexpected happens. Someone nods. Someone says, "Me neither." Someone leans forward, slightly relieved. That moment, that small, terrifying moment of transparency, can be the first crack in a very old wall. What follows is not a cure. It is a reorientation, a gradual, imperfect, deeply human process of learning to let achievements belong to the self, of practicing, and it is a practice, not a destination, what psychologists call internalization. The ability to receive evidence of competence and allow it to settle, to resist the habitual reach for alternative explanations, to sit with "I did this," instead of immediately moving to "but." Part of this involves learning to distinguish between the voice of genuine self-reflection, which is healthy, which is what makes a person grow, and the voice of chronic self-dismissal, which is the imposter speaking. They sound similar, but their intentions are different. One asks questions in order to understand. The other asks questions in order to diminish. Learning to hear the difference is slow work, patient work, but it is possible, and something else happens in the process. As the grip of the pattern loosens, space begins to open up, space for something that high achievers often have very little of: rest. Not earned rest, not deserved rest, simply rest. The kind that doesn't require justification. The kind that belongs to a person not because of what they've produced, but because they are here, alive, human, enough in this moment, without proof. The credentials on the wall don't change. The accomplishments don't disappear. but they begin to feel different, less like a costume, less like evidence that needs constant supplementing, more like a true record of a real person who tried and learned and kept going. And slowly, not all at once, but slowly, the applause begins to land. Not every time, not without effort, but sometimes, in a quiet room after something has gone well, the mind does not immediately reach for the counter-argument. It simply rests for a moment in what is true. This happened. I was here. I did this. There is a particular kind of peace that lives inside that sentence. Small, unannounced, easy to overlook, but real. Deeply, quietly, entirely real. And perhaps that is where this story ends, not with the absence of doubt, but with its loosening. Not with perfect confidence, but with a gentler relationship between a person and their own story. A willingness to stand inside an achievement without immediately looking for the exit. The world will continue to clap. The voice inside may continue to whisper. But there is another voice too, older than the doubt, quieter than the fear, and it has been there all along, waiting, with extraordinary patience, to be heard. It says only this: you were never an imposter, you were only human, and that was always enough.